Hello, and welcome to Same Crime, Different Time. I'm Jennifer Chambers. You know that I'm passionate about uncovering the truth. Here, we're taking that passion to the dark heart of the Pacific Northwest. As a true crime and historical writer, I've spent years immersed in the chilling archives of this region. Each week, we'll explore cases, both ancient and modern, of murder, unexplained events, strange places, and those who have simply vanished. We'll dig into the research, connecting the dots between past and present, revealing the threads of mystery that weave through our incredible, yet often unsettling, landscape. Prepare to be captivated as we discover that while times may change, the darkest aspects of human nature remain hauntingly the same. Sometimes, Oregon's forests feel older than time itself. They're quiet, watchful, and impossibly patient. But on a warm day, in August 1987, the Molalla forest stopped being a sanctuary. It became a graveyard. 6 women buried beneath the trees, 1 man linked to them all, and a community forced to confront the predator hiding in plain sight. Today, we're going deep into the case of Dayton Leroy Rogers, known in headlines as the Molalla Forest Killer. This is Same Crime, Different Time, and I'm your host, Jen Chambers. Stay close, the woods have stories to tell us today. Welcome back to Same Crime, Different Time. Today, we're walking into one of Oregon's darkest cases, and this is one that I've studied closely. If you've read my book, Murder Mayhem in the Willamette Valley, you might remember my chapter on Dayton Leroy Rogers. I wrote then, the Molalla forest seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself knew the violence hidden beneath its moss. This case stretches from Portland's old 82nd Avenue sex work corridor to the remote logging spurs of Clackamas County. It's a story about misogyny, addiction, predation, and the women whose lives were treated as disposable by the man who hunted them. Most of all, it's a story about victims who deserve more than a footnote, and a killer whose crimes would lead Oregon into one of the state's longest courtroom sagas. Today, we'll explore who Dayton Rogers was, how the murders unfolded, what investigators uncovered in the Molalla forest, the complex, decades-long legal aftermath, and why this case still shapes Oregon's criminal justice conversations. Let's begin where it all broke open, in August 1987. Part 1, The Last Victim and the Man Who Ran. Before police ever found the forest graves, everything started with one survivor. On August 10th, 1987, police were called to a diner parking lot in Oregon City. Oregon City is near Portland, Oregon. A woman staggered out of the brush near the diner. Her throat was slashed, and she said a man had attacked her after picking her up for sex work. She named him, she described his orange pickup, and she led police back to the scene. What incredible bravery. The man who attacked her was Dayton Leroy Rogers. He was a married father, a chainsaw repairman, a Vietnam-era veteran, and a longtime client of the vulnerable women who worked on Portland streets. His colleagues knew him for his calm demeanor, but sex workers knew him for his violence. According to court records and front-page coverage that was in the Oregonian newspaper, at that time Rogers fled the scene, but he was arrested within hours. What investigators didn't know yet was that this wasn't an isolated attack. It was more like a crack in a dam. Part 2, Discovery in the Forest. 3 months after his arrest, a hunter in the Molalla forest discovered something grisly. One decomposed body, and then another, and another. Ultimately, 7 victims were recovered. These women were all connected to Portland's survival sex work community. There was an unidentified adult woman, a woman called Christine Adams, a woman named Cynthia DeVore, Rita LeClaire, Maureen Hodges, Jennifer Smith, and a Jane Doe. The Oregonian's 1987 through 1988 coverage described this quote-unquote pattern of violence that linked the victims. They had similar bindings, they had similar injuries, and they were all disposed of in a similar way in the forest. The forensic investigators found that there were knife wounds that were described as distinctive. They all had binding marks that were consistent with using nylon rope. There was evidence that this killer had visited the dump sites repeatedly. And there were tire tracks that linked back to a vehicle that matched Dayton Leroy Rogers' truck. This wasn't an impulsive violence. This was ritualized, repeated predation. As I wrote in Murder Mayhem in the Willamette Valley, quote, Rogers didn't simply kill, he returned to the forest as if the land itself was part of his ritual, unquote. Part 3. The Women Who Deserved Better. One of the painful truths in this case is how quickly the media labeled these victims. They were called prostitutes, street women, and drug addicts. Their humanity was secondary. Their lives were background noise. These women were daughters and friends and survivors who were navigating the edges of a system that offered them almost nothing. Though police records and archived reporting can tell us the tale, we know that many were living with addiction. Many of them were homeless or housing insecure. A lot of them were estranged from families, and they were criminalized by vice policing. And that made them vulnerable to someone like Rogers. According to testimony in the courts, he used the women's survival needs against them. When you read the old newspaper archives now, the gaps are obvious. When I researched this case for my book, I wrote, quote, the women lost in the Molalla forest were not nameless shadows. They loved music, they joked with friends. They fought to stay alive in a world that punished their survival, unquote. I want to talk about what the headlines stripped away, their voices. And I think that telling their story is the best way we can do that. Part 4, the trial, the appeals, and the decades-long legal maze. Dayton Leroy Rogers was charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder. The trial was massive. There was front-page coverage for months and months. Prosecutors talked about Rogers as a sexual sadist who literally targeted these women in survival sex work because he didn't think anyone would look for them. So he did it on purpose. And they showed that to the jury. The jury agreed, and he was sentenced to death. But then came the appeals. Oregon's death penalty system is its own labyrinth, and I'm not going to debate whether or not the death penalty is just. I go back and forth, honestly. But at any rate, here's how it looked. In 1992, the death sentence in Oregon was overturned, and then it was reinstated in 2002. It was overturned again in 2012, and in 2015, it was reinstated yet again. So in 2021 through 22, Oregon halted all the executions and commuted everyone on death row. So it's interesting. That could be a whole different episode. It's funny, when I was in high school, I wrote about being pro-death penalty, and now I just am not so sure. But at the same time, I think sometimes it's justifiable. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe also it's not. But anyway, I said I wasn't going to debate it. The interesting thing about that within this case is that because his case occurred and his incarceration occurred during this period of time, it was on and off and on and off and on and off. His case actually became one of the longest-running capital litigation sagas in our history. Each new ruling reopened all the wounds of these victims' families. Many of these people's families told reporters that they felt trapped in the endless loop of Oregon's capital punishment idea. And he is now serving life without parole. Part 5, Psychology of the Predator. I always think this part is interesting because part of what I like about true crime is trying to figure out why people do what they do. I've listened to and read so many things about true crime and studied it. And in a lot of cases, there's no reason. I don't know that there's any one definitive reason, but I do think it's interesting to read what psychologists say about these killers. And psychologists who evaluated Rogers described him as a paraphilic offender with ritualized behavior patterns. The forensic analysis over the different years talked about his escalation, the pre-planning he did, the idea that he was reenacting fantasies, and that he had that dual life. I've talked about that in a couple of weeks now. People who are a family man and then a predator in the forest on the side, who was able to target these women that he perceived as being socially invisible. And this profile fits a known pattern. Men who choose victims they believe society won't protect. I don't have to tell you, if you listen to true crime, you know that it's a pretty common story. But the Molalla Forest case makes me think of why these predators consistently target these marginalized women, particularly here, and what mechanisms allowed him to operate so long without detection. Some of it is just the time period, right? In the 80s, 70s, and 80s, it was they say it's the golden age of serial killers, right? What might have been the outcome for these women if the social safety net in Oregon had been different? In the end, the Molalla Forest holds the memory of what happened there, but so do we. When I wrote about him in my book, it wasn't the killer who stayed with me. It was these women, their stories and their names, and the way that they deserved protection and dignity long before the courtroom ever said their names aloud. Cases like this remind me that true crime isn't spectacle, it's an archive of loss. And it's a call for care, particularly care for those who live in the margins. It's just a tragic, tragic story. But it's a call for caring for people who can use help on the outside. If you have local stories or historical stories or regional mysteries you want me to explore, you can email me at scdtpod@gmail.com. I'm Jen Chambers, and this is Same Crime, Different Time. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and look out for one another, especially those the world tries not to see.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Thanks for listening today. Please review and rate wherever you listen to podcasts. That really helps out the show. And please leave us a voicemail at the Spotify link. Also, you can always feel free to send us an email at scdtmail@gmail.com or www.jennifer-chambers.com.